Alright, guys, welcome to my Heidegger blog. I'm going to be talking about this book, Martin Heidegger's History of the Concept of Time. Why I chose this book? Well, first, you're going to find that people recommend this book as a introduction to being in time, that it actually has the same concepts and topics as being in time, but explained in a much more clear manner. Even Gadamer said that this is the original form of being in time. And it is a series of lecture notes that Heidegger gave in 1925 to the theology department of the University of Marburg. And yeah, so I'm gonna, every 50 pages, I will summarize the main points. I'm just gonna go over my bullet notes, and I'm gonna try to distill the main points, and I'm also gonna give a little bit of my opinion on the matter. So this is gonna be biased. It is a blog after all. So let's start. Why, in the introduction, Heidegger talks about why is he dealing with the history of the concept of time, and why time. So to begin with, time, Heidegger says, is what allows beings to be entities. Time is what allows beings to be intelligible as such. What that means is beings to be intelligible as beings. And Heidegger is a very historical thinker. Some people even say very etymological thinker. So Heidegger goes back to the idea that to really understand something, you have to understand it in a historical way. You have to understand the time in a historical way to properly understand the concept of time. And it's not history in the sense of historiology. This is a word that they mention actually quite a lot in translations of Heidegger as a mocking of the fact-collecting nature of some certain historical writers. It's more of a historical understanding that allows you to understand the essential components of the subject. And that Heidegger says, after you arrive at a historical analysis of it, you can arrive at a phenomenological mode of understanding. And he will explain what phenomenology is in the latter pages, but you arrive at a phenomenological understanding, and it is through this that you understand time. And then time is what allows you to understand the realities of natural sciences, and the realities of the historical sciences. So you arrive at an understanding that is prior to the study of science and prior to the study of history, thanks to this phenomenological mode of understanding of time. So basically, Heidegger is trying to arrive at a prior form of understanding that allows for the possibility of a study of nature and of a study of history. And he does this through the study of time and through the study of the history of the concept of time. That's basically the introduction to this. And now let's go over the next pages. In the next pages, he starts with something that I don't find that interesting. I think we've all heard these discussions over and over. It relates to, positivism, neo-Kantianism, this idea that at the time, 19th century, 20th century philosophy was trying to justify the success of science. And, Kant plays neo-Kantianism, and using Kant's method of questioning plays a very important role. And of course, I guess it is an interesting point in history because, math had a crisis in the sense that mathematicians were trying to justify the success of math as well, and what math is to begin with. I mean, that's what Husserl started his career in. But not only that, we have very successful mathematicians like David Hilbert and Brouwer and starting all these different schools of the philosophy of math. And then you also have a crisis in the sciences, and you have a crisis in philosophy. Philosophy has an own internal questioning of what its methods should be. And I think the general agreement at the time was that it should just be a propedeutic. I guess they use this word a lot, or a sort of like auxiliary to a helper of science, maybe that's the right word. That's positivism, and it's a very scientific outlook for philosophy. And Heidegger mentions, I thought this was interesting actually. I still don't know exactly how though, but Heidegger mentions that this is a response to idealism and a throwing away of idealistic systems. And so he then goes on to the next point that I think starts relating more to what the book is going to be about, is that the natural sciences start expanding into the physiological and biological sphere. Not only that, it also starts expanding into the psychological sphere. And we can see this, for example, with Helmholtz. Helmholtz was a German physicist. He's actually quite legit. He's very important for electrodynamics and acoustics. But he also started studying the sense organs. He started studying the eyes. He started studying the ear, the auditory, and the optical system. And we then see a sort of scientific understanding of psychology. We start seeing the inception of the science of psychology. And we also see the influence of British empiricism and Descartes in the inception of what is now the science of consciousness, and almost psychology as it is seen today. It is to an extent, but I guess they were understanding it a little bit different back then, and it was the science of consciousness. So what we see now is that the natural sciences, and this was, I guess, impressive for people at the time, the natural sciences start stepping into the psychological sphere by means of physiology, which is, I think, important to note here. And I'm going to quote this exactly because I think this is actually related to the rest of Heidegger's philosophy. And I haven't obviously read Being and Time, but I just know that they say that this is a very important subject. Basically the subject-object split, and the whole notion of the Cartesian view and Descartes and the science of consciousness. So Heidegger now says, and I thought this was worth quoting word by word, is in the Middle Ages and in Greek philosophy, the whole man was still seen. Inner psychic life, what we now so readily call consciousness, was apprehended in a natural experience which was not regarded as an inner perception and so set off from an outer one. So again, the subject-object split, and how the Greeks basically saw it in a different way. It was not understood as this split, the mind seeing the external world or things of that nature. And I think this is really crucial to Heidegger's commentary on the Pre-Socratics, which I have read through actually this book, Parmenides. In that book, he goes very much in depth into the Pre-Socratic understanding of being. And hopefully we also talk about that in this book, and I can also understand it better. But so psychology begins to transport itself to philosophy as well. So this is a new thing as well, that psychology starts having to deal with philosophical subjects. We can imagine, for example, ethics and other subjects that were traditionally philosophical start now having psychological explanations in terms of whatever people saw as the science of psychology at the time. So that's where it is, his discussion of science. And he leaves it there. And I think it's a good place to stop for what's the next discussion, which is the reality of the historical sciences. And this thinker, Dithley, I don't know exactly the academic tree here, but we know that Dithley is someone that Heidegger read a lot, actually. So there's this book by John Stuart Mill, very famous philosopher, Logic of the Moral Sciences, and Dithley is against it, saying that the object of the historical sciences is of a different nature than what John Stuart Mill was saying, and that the object of the historical sciences is considered life, in quotations, life. So it's a special understanding of the word life. And he basically says that the reality of the historical sciences is life. And Heidegger actually likes Dithley quite a lot, but he mentions that Dithley, maybe through pressure, was pressured not to pursue his own methods that much. But in general, we can say that the 19th century produced a scientific philosophy, a theory of sciences. It uses scientific methods for itself. For example, we can think logical positivism, and it forms the science of consciousness, a psychology. But this is where I guess someone that Husserl and Heidegger actually liked quite a lot, Franz Brentano. This is where he steps in at a very important moment, and he is quite an original thinker, it seems. And he writes a book called Psychology from an Empirical Standpoint. So I'm just first going to talk about Brentano a little bit. I think Brentano is quite interesting. He actually started studying theology, but he was a major scholar of Aristotle. And it's quite interesting. His goal here was to study Aristotle in such a way that he could push aside all the scholastic readings of Aristotle. And then he dealt very much with the notion of being with a capital B, and he has actually a book on the understandings of being in Aristotle. And he then got away from the theological seminary, I guess, and started doing his own thing. He is considered one of the major figures in early psychology, and he's considered the founder of phenomenology. But through this book, Psychology from an Empirical Standpoint, he opposes the methods of natural science and physiology to the exploration of psychic life. And he tries to classify psychic life. He tries to classify the structures of the psyche. And Brentano actually has a famous saying that, let's see, I actually didn't take note of that, but it's here in the book. I won't even bother finding it, but he says that the same way that natural sciences uses its methods, philosophy should also use its own methods, or at least studies of psychology, of the psychic should use its own methods. And when he says things like psychology from an empirical standpoint, he's not using the word empirical in the modern sense that you collect data and you analyze your data and do experiments in the form of empiricism. He actually is starting to refer to the first forms of phenomenology. He's starting to deal with what's readily and available to experience and what's right there to experience. And he's trying to understand psychology from what is right there in front of you in terms of your lived experience. He's trying to study psychology from that level. I wish I find this. Let me try to find that quote actually, because it's an interesting twist that he has here. Let's see. So, the true philosophical method is none other than that of the natural sciences. And Heidegger says, it would be wrong to interpret this thesis as a call to transpose the methods of natural science into philosophy. This thesis rather means that a philosophy has to proceed in its field exactly as the natural sciences do in theirs. Namely, it has to draw its concepts from its own matters. Yeah, so it's the beginning of phenomenology, you could say. And to deal with what's right there, go back to the phenomena itself, as Husserl says it. So, Brentano avoids all preconceptions and deals with the psychic as it appears immediately to consciousness. He aims for a classification of psychic phenomena and pinpoints intentionality as the key thing that characterizes psychic phenomena versus physical phenomena. And so here is his one of his most original concepts is the notion of intentionality. He talks about how what really separates psychic phenomena from physical phenomena is intentionality. So going back to the Latin root of intentionality, intentio is a directing towards. And and I guess there's the intentum, which is what's directed at. But sorry. Intentionality is basically the fact that psychic phenomena always is directed towards something. So what does that mean exactly? The idea of representing, which is, think of representing as like imagining a picture in your mind or something. There is the represented in the representing. If you will something, there is the willed. So this target thing going on here. If you feel something, there's the field, the feeling. If you see something, you see. If you perceive something, there's the object of perception. If you represent something, there's the represented. If you value something, there's the valued. This whole idea is what intentionality is all about, and Brentano thinks it's quite essential to understand psychic phenomena in that way. And Heidegger, I know it sounds trivial right now to say that it's quite obvious to us that, things work this way. Like maybe just from a linguistic point of view, we can see that, if you value something, there's the valued. But Heidegger actually warns us to not consider it that trivial, and that there's actually a lot more to it. And he will go more in depth into intentionality. And I'm sure that he actually talks about it in many other books. Husserl also talks about intentionality quite a lot. So Brentano says each lived experience directs itself towards something in a way which varies. So Brentano uses intentionality to classify psychic phenomena, classify things like representation, judgment, and interest. But then came Husserl. Husserl is Heidegger's PhD advisor, who was deeply motivated by Brentano. His initial 12-year-long work was logical investigations that had a deep impact on even Dithely. And actually, this is quite interesting. As you might know, Heidegger was a PhD student of Husserl, but people consider him he deviated away from Husserl's way of thinking. And even Husserl himself said that being in time was merely philosophical anthropology, right? But what's interesting here is that Heidegger actually criticizes Husserl, and Heidegger says that how demanding logical investigations is not worthy of what's actually contained in the book. So the book is a lot more demanding and basically costs more effort to us than what is actually worth it. Like it's not worth studying Husserl. At least that's kind of what I read into what Heidegger was saying. Okay, so last bit here. Let's see. Fundamental discoveries of intentionality. So, phenomenology was criticized by people like Reichert for the metaphysical dogmas present in the concept of intentionality. So, intentionality was something that people did not like because they say it had metaphysical dogma, and by that they mean that if you have that every psychic phenomena has a target, it's an intentum, it's directed towards something, then people interpreted this as like something that it's positing the existence of the external world, which everybody knows is questionable. At least from a philosophical standpoint, you can't really defend the existence of the external world. And if intentionality is directing itself towards something, then people understood it as it's directing itself towards the external world. And Reichert didn't like that. Heidegger says that Reichert actually did not understand the concept at all. And intentionality has ties to Aristotle and the scholastics. We can see this because I actually asked ChatGPT in what way Aristotle talks about intentionality, and it turns out that Aristotle's theory of perception actually, at least according to ChatGPT, it's that for perception also had this directedness aspect to it in Aristotle. That's quite interesting. So Heidegger again warns us that to grasp intentionality, you must remove all prejudices in order to grasp the matters themselves. So you have to try to understand intentionality anew, afresh. Try to get rid of your preconceptions and try to just see it for what it is. And each lived experience is directed towards something. And again, this sounds trivial. Heidegger advises us to pursue this triviality further. And that you give up on the predictable epistemological considerations of intentionality. So things like this external world type of thing. Perception is intrinsically intentional. So Heidegger says that Reichert is full of these preconceived theories and preconceptions that were limiting him from really understanding intentionality. And for example, he insists that representing is not knowing and is thus fully immanent. I don't think that's that important, actually. Reichert seems to say that representing isn't intentional, but judging is, and his inspiration on this front is a response to dogma. The tricky part of it in intentionality is representing. Yeah, like I said, Reichert, at the very end, he was just concerned that there was this intentionality tries to imply the existence of the external world. And Reichert, again, is plagued by theories of natural sciences. Representation confuses him because it seems to imply external world, and to suggest that knowledge can come from representing troubles him. But Heidegger tells us to go back to the matters themselves. When you see a chair, you aren't intent on seeing the representation of something. You just see a chair. So Heidegger is just going back to the phenomenological approach of just seeing what's directly in front of you in your mind, and to not come at this subject with all these theories of the way science works. And intentionality is not a theory of the relation between the psychic and the physical world. It is just a description of the structure of the psychic itself. That's interesting. And acts are related to each other by intentionality. So now Heidegger goes on into, I guess, a little more the way phenomenology works and some of the things it starts considering, I suppose. I'm actually about to finish this clip, this first 50 pages, but I suppose it'll start saying more interesting stuff. But for now, it's phenomenology again. So Heidegger now goes into a little bit more on the structure of the psychic. He's gonna start talking a little bit more about phenomenology and what is the kinds of things that it starts to classify and to acknowledge in science, not in science, in consciousness. Like I said, we're going back to the phenomena themselves, like Husserl would say, and I guess he will. I'm actually about to finish this, like I said, first 50 pages, but it seems like he will go and say actually something more deep. But he's saying that in the perceived, there are different modes of perception, and you can basically see something as an environing thing, which means that if you see, for example, a chair, you will see it as the chair that exists in my apartment, for example. You can also see something as natural. So, for example, if you see a chair, you might see it, for example, made out of wood and having in its natural way of seeing it. And there is also this material conception of the chair. And these are structures presented to the mind and are obvious prior to any scientific theory. And I think it's true. I think it's just the way we perceive things. There are different ways of perceiving it according to a different understanding of the object, and it's just things that present themselves to the mind. And he then goes on to talk about perceivedness, and he says that perceivedness is not the structure of how it is represented, but the way and the manner of how it is represented. So that's something interesting. It's not the structure of how it is represented, but the way and the manner of how it is perceived. I think I said represented. So perceivedness is not the structure of how it is represented, but the way and the manner of how it is perceived. So another thing that perception does, and I think this is actually more interesting. I think this tells us something. I thought this was a unique point, and I think Husserl is the first one that really talks about this, but perception involves seeing things in their thing totality. What does that mean? Things do not present themselves wholly. They hide aspects, yet my intention is constant throughout in its aim and intends the thing in its totality. So what that means is that perception, it sees something, and things are always they always hide something from you. Right now I look at my phone, but I don't see the back of it, and as I spin it around and stuff, I don't see the entirety of it. But basically perception intends things in their thing totality. So that means that no matter what face of the thing is being hidden, I always know that I'm seeing the object as a whole. I'm seeing the phone as a whole. In this case, the phone. The notebook, if the other side is hidden, intentionality, the intention is always the thing as a whole. And this goes back to Husserl's terms of, this whole perceive it, and perception. There is noesis, that's perceiving, noema, that's perceived, and noein, that's perception. I guess we will go into more of that in greater detail in the next 50 pages, but Heidegger calls for an interpretation of intentionality that overcomes traditional theories of immanently conscious. So immanently conscious would mean like something that's purely inside of the mind, the way Descartes would understand it. So yeah, that's the first 50 pages. We have the 4 objects of intentionality in the how of its being intended. Yeah, this is an extra topic. Another thing he talks about is that the how of its being intended. You have when you speak about something, it's called empty intended. It has an empty intention. Why? Because you speak about a certain thing, you intend it, but it's not fully visualized. It's just empty there. Then you can have intuitive fulfillment if you, for example, say a bridge, but you go one step above and you actually imagine a bridge in your mind. You have some intuitive fulfillment there. And then there's the bodily given, which would be the bodily given would be if you actually stand in front of a bridge. That's the maximum form of intuitive fulfillment of an object of intentionality. And then we also have this whole thing about the thing totality and the adumbrations and stuff. But yeah, let's see what the next 50 pages say.